Hello, greetings, friends. I bring greetings from Sierra Cascades Yearly Meeting of Friends and North Valley Friends, where I worship. And thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to be with you all. I got to attend Princeton monthly meeting for several years while I was doing my master's degree in New Jersey, but I never got to go to annual sessions. So this is my first time at Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. So it's fun to be with you all, even if it has to be virtually. So I'm coming to you from my home office in Newberg, Oregon, which is outside of Portland. And I am on Kalapuya land, which is now part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. So I invite you to take a moment to also remember the Indigenous peoples who stewarded the land that you are currently living on and coming in from today as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my traveling elder, Dove John. Thank you so much for being with me, Dove, and I really appreciate Dove's spiritual and moral support as I travel in the ministry, and she provides a lot of prayer support as well as great ideas and thoughts. So thank you so much for that support and for being with me today. And thank you also to Olivia Brangan and Ruth Darlington, who have served as my anchor committee from Philadelphia Yearly Meeting as I've prepared to share this message with you all. So I'm encouraged by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting's emphasis on climate justice with the sprint report just discussed in the last session, moving forward together in the face of climate change. And you have decades worth of statements, queries, and minutes on climate and environmental concerns as a yearly meeting. I get the sense that friends do not need to be convinced that anthropogenic climate change and environmental concerns are a problem and they're happening, or that they're deeply connected to justice issues, particularly racial justice, but that friends are ready to actively engage in this work now. So that's the space that I'm hoping that you're all in and how I'm approaching this message. The other day in Nikki Musgrove's opening keynote address, she asked how many friends in attendance were interested in community-focused work, and the result of the poll was that 99% of you were indeed interested in community-focused work. So that's good news because that's what I'll be talking about today. This talk is entitled Building Hubs of Climate Resilience, Will Friends Act in Radical Faithfulness? So I'll be sharing with you about hubs of climate resilience, but primarily how do we act, how are we called to act in this moment? I want you to consider what it would look like for friends to participate in and build up hubs of positive climate resilience in collaboration with your communities. And this is a way of uprooting injustice and rooting justice. I think that's part of your theme as well, that we're digging in deep to take out the roots of injustice that have grown in us in some ways as we have interacted with our American culture and the cultures around us. And then rooting deeply in justice, connecting deeply into the earth, grounding in grounding our every action in the spirit and in the living water that runs deep, sustaining us. While there's so much to be proud of in our heritage as friends, it's also important to recognize that there are many harmful parts of our American culture that have also taken root in our lives and Quaker practices. Also, from Nikki Musgrove's talk, she reworded Micah 6:8 as queries. And she suggested the query, what do we as friends require of each other? What is required of our beloved community? And how do we share our light with the world as it pertains to racial justice? I would extend this to also include climate justice. And so just one added word there. That's what we'll be kind of orienting our time around this afternoon. What do we as friends require of each other? What is required of our beloved community? And how do we share our light with the world as it pertains to racial and climate justice? So let's just take a moment to reflect and center ourselves using these queries and preparing our hearts for this time together. So take a moment, friends, and just become centered here in this moment. To these queries, I would add another query. You may, oops, this is Micah 6:8, but we'll get to that momentarily. You may remember when WWJD was a fad catchphrase, meaning, what would Jesus do? And for our time together, I'm going to put a Quaker twist on that query and query us WWJWD, what would John Woolman do? So when I think of Micah 6:8, which says, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. I think the Quaker who most famously and inspirationally lived this out is Philadelphia Yearly Meeting's own John Woolman. Woolman was already putting the pieces together regarding racial justice, ecological concerns, and the economy back in the 18th century. Ideas that the rest of us are now catching up to. So what do you think John Woolman would be doing in our own time? What would he not be doing? In case you're not familiar, Woolman was a friend known for his outspokenness against slavery and for living out his convictions, not purchasing products made by slave labor, not writing up wills that included passing on enslaved people as property, and refusing to receive hospitality in homes where people were enslaved. He was also very concerned about what we would now call pollution and overuse of natural resources. He spoke out against U.S. against the U.S. economic system that could see people as property and create disposable resources. So I ask you to consider, what would John Woolman do if he was alive today? Take a moment to allow the Spirit to query you about that. So what would John Woolman do if he was alive today? Now check in with your spirit, your emotions, and your body. How do you feel? What are you feeling? I don't know what you all are feeling, but I will share what I think about and feel when I consider this query. And I guess I feel pretty convicted. Woolman lived his life with such exemplary and overwhelming integrity. And I know that even though I try to live with integrity regarding my understanding of justice and right relationship with people and planet, but there are many ways that my actions still fall short. I can feel myself feeling fear about what it would look like to live like that, what I would be required to give up, fear about how I would be able to survive and feed and clothe and house my family, fear about being too countercultural. I can also sense in myself quite a bit of shame, knowing that what I know and that I understand the consequences of my choices, and I still live in just a slightly more ecological way than the average American. I feel shame about the actions of my European American ancestors, homesteading land across the American frontier by destroying ecosystems, displacing indigenous people, benefiting from enslaved people's labor, and receiving land and other economic benefits due to their skin color. And on some days, I feel a sense of overwhelm and despair about the immensity of intersecting problems that we face. Perhaps you feel similarly right now when you consider that what John Woolman would be doing in our time. I want you to sit with that and acknowledge those feelings for a moment. Allow yourself to feel them and invite the Spirit to be present with you as you sit with that. In addition to these hard and painful emotions, I also feel quite a bit of hope and joy and a sense of commitment when I consider John Woolman's example, and I wonder if you feel the same way. Woolman's actions and words made a difference. People saw the Spirit at work in him, and they were convinced, eventually, to take action that was both obviously just and also quite radical at the time. In Woolman, I see an example of someone who lived his convictions with as much integrity as he could, grounded in love. He influenced Philadelphia Yearly Meeting's rejection of the slave trade, and his example inspired many other friends to work toward abolition. So his example feels hopeful to me. I'm grateful for this spiritual forebear in our tradition who spoke up and who walked his talk, who lived in an incredibly countercultural way, and who is deeply grounded in the inward light of Christ and love of God, neighbor, and creation. When I think about what it might look like to live out Micah 6:8, he's one example that comes to mind of what it might look like to live justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Although we may at first feel fear, perhaps shame, and a sense of overwhelming despair when imagining our own lives in comparison to how John Woolman may have lived if he were alive today, I invite us to recognize and acknowledge those feelings and to not get stuck there. I encourage you to let his example inspire you and give you courage for the work ahead. As we think about building hubs of positive climate resilience in our own time, I have one more thing to say about John Woolman. It seems to me like he probably felt very lonely, doing the important work he was doing, but at a level that many around him found over the top and ridiculous. But what if he had had a community? What if the whole yearly meeting had heard and responded to the Spirit speaking through his calling? What if they had been willing to take the steps that it took, to take the steps that he took, and to do so together in community? Can you imagine what that would have felt like and what sort of impact they would have been able to make? As it was, it took decades from when Woolman first brought up his concern to his monthly meeting to when the yearly meeting finally took a clear stand against slavery. In regards to climate change and the intersecting web of ecological injustice issues we're experiencing today, we are already decades in. In your yearly meeting, friends have been speaking up about environmental care for almost 50 years. I'm hopeful that now is the moment when people are poised and ready to take real, meaningful, and countercultural action to move toward a just and sustainable future, a closer embodiment of the beloved community. Therefore, with the rest of our time together, I'm going to walk us through some different aspects of the work we need to do collectively, giving ample time for you to reflect on your own role as an individual, the work of your meeting, and how you might collectively engage in this work as a yearly meeting. I'm going to first offer some framing of the types of change we need to engage in, then share some tools and ideas based on my experiences and those of others, and conclude with some thoughts about maintaining and growing your sense of hope, even in the midst of these challenging times. So first, what is the work that we need to do collectively to meet the challenges of our time? There are different levels of environmental action that we can engage in, and each of these levels increases in impact. So here are the levels. This is a chart from a study by Amel et al. You can take action at the level of your own individual and your household, such as maybe having more environmentally friendly purchases, reusing things, composting, driving an electric vehicle, getting solar panels, and so forth. These are great, but they will only have a small impact, although they're important for your own personal sense of integrity and as an example for others, like Woolman. But if Woolman had only engaged in personal actions without doing other work to change the system that upheld slavery, he probably wouldn't have been able to make as much of an impact, right? So going up the levels of action, we can work on educating and helping our friends and family, our social network. We can shift our community and our organization's lives toward living more sustainably and work with our neighborhoods. And then the biggest two ways to have a positive environmental impact are in public and cultural spaces. And so we can shift public policy, we can engage in activism, and we can shift people's cultural norms, systems, and worldviews at this cultural level. Therefore, we're going to start with the type of worldview shift we need to make from American values to a more sustainable and just worldview. And I think this worldview fits our friends' values. We just don't necessarily live that way authentically all the time. So for working toward this worldview shift, I think your yearly meeting's two emphases on racial and climate justice are right on target. As you're probably aware, these two goals are not exactly separate, but they impact and are impacted by each other. Research shows that toxic waste and the presence of other polluting facilities are consistently correlated with communities of color in the US more than any other metric. And there are a multitude of other ways that the impacts of climate change and environmental hazards disproportionately affect communities of color in the US as well as the global South. Those from all types of traditionally marginalized communities are more likely to experience these negative impacts. Nikki Musgrove said in answer to one of the questions she received during her keynote Q&A that she didn't feel led to talk about power, but this is something that I do feel led to talk about and was planning to. So I think the Spirit is leading both of us in our own ways to speak a particular message to you all. So anthropogenic climate change, racial justice, and other oppressions are all connected to the power structures on which our society is built. And I'll call it the domination system. Within this system of domination, each of us gains social power by being perceived as above others on a hierarchy. The main worldview shift we need to make can be summarized in this graphic that is next. Just a moment. This graphic here. We're moving from an ego to an eco perspective. With this shift in worldview, we move from imagining ourselves as a species at the pinnacle of the created order to being a participant in the community of all life. This system of domination is not limited to American society, but can be found in any empire. It forms the basis for imperial power structures. In the US, we inherited this from the European nations who colonized this hemisphere and elsewhere, and it's been passed down from the Roman Empire and the empires that preceded Rome. The point being, this system of domination supports and upholds the basis for an empire's power. The Americas were colonized based on this power structure, with the Catholic Church and then the Church of England giving authority to the political states to claim land that was not populated by Christians for their throne. A series of papal bulls, which are documents by popes, were issued during the 15th century, collectively called the Doctrine of Discovery, providing justification for explorers to claim terra nullius, or empty lands owned by Muslims, and then expanding to include the lands of anyone not a Christian in the New World. This was also used as a basis for slavery, authorizing Christians to enslave anyone who is not Christian so they might be evangelized. When a European explorer discovered the mouth of a river, he could claim the entire watershed for his country in an act we might call Watershed Conquest. And that's it. That's the basis for the land claims of Europeans here on Turtle Island. The English followed suit, and this formed the basis for the land claims of English colonists, including William Penn. We can appreciate that Penn did better than most in that he didn't only take the land claim he was given from the English crown, but he also paid the native people, the Delaware, for the land. So a small portion of the land of Philadelphia was bought relatively fairly, although Penn's son swindled the Delaware out of more than they had agreed to give for the sum after Penn's death. Also, Penn held slaves, the support for which goes back to the Doctrine of Discovery, but which later, of course, became race-based rather than based on whether or not one was a Christian. So as we work on this shift in perspective from ego to eco, it's important to revisit some of our stories we like to tell ourselves as friends about our history. We can appreciate, for example, that Penn was ahead of his time in recognizing the humanity of the indigenous people of this land, while also recognizing the fact that most of us don't live on the land that he purchased fairly. Most of us live on land that was acquired through less than fair treaties, or even before there were treaties made. In my own case, I live on land given away to white or half-breed Indian male settlers and their wives by the US government before Oregon was a state and before treaties were made with the Kalapuya and what are now the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Quakers moved here to Newberg, Oregon, with the intention of founding a new Quaker community. similar to the impetus to move to Pennsylvania, I suppose, but they didn't seem to notice or mind that Oregon was a whites-only state. No people of color were allowed to legally live here. This means that white Quakers could move here and receive the benefit of donation land claims and fairly cheap land once those were broken down into smaller parcels. But although the denomination had been involved in the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement, they moved here and received the benefits of being of European heritage when others could not receive those benefits. This happened all across colonial America and the frontier. Although Quakers did some great things in our past, white Quakers also received the benefits of being white, including much greater access to land, resources, and other forms of social and economic power to a greater extent than people of color and indigenous people. Therefore, this worldview shift from ego to eco that I mentioned above also has to shift our understanding of our relationships with other people, and this impacts the way we structure our economy. When living with an ego perspective, we need to gain power and control over as much as possible, claiming as many resources for ourselves as we can, because otherwise someone else will get them and we may not have enough. This perspective expects a zero-sum mentality, and it places worth and value on what we can produce. If I can't produce enough to meet my own needs, I should feel ashamed in this system because I'm not a person of worth or value. I have to ask for help. Therefore, if I'm benevolent enough to be able to give away funds and resources to others, if I can offer charity, I have power over those to whom I am giving. I am the one who has, and they are the ones who need. I am the one with value, and I have control over who receives my benevolence. Instead of this charity model, it's important for us to shift our worldview toward a mutual aid model. In reality, none of us can survive on our own. We need other people to do jobs we don't know how to do. One person can't very easily do all the things required for them to survive. We also need other species. We need food to eat. We need bacteria in our gut to help break down the food we eat. And we need plants to cycle the light, air, and water so they're in a usable form for us. We need fungi and microorganisms to break down organic matter into soil so more things can grow so we can eat. We're integrated members of an ecosystem, a community, in which each member is important. It's perhaps fairly easy for us to get on board with this idea of harmony and everyone's part of this great circle of life, isn't it beautiful? But when this worldview shift starts touching our money and our power, we tend to get more wary and resistant if we benefit from the system as it is. If we're white, or if we've managed to gain some sort of a foothold in today's society and economy, it's appealing to believe we got here because we earned it, because we're better than those who don't or can't make it. So I want you to take a deep breath and invite the spirit to open you up so you can hear this part. This shift in worldview requires us to move from individualism and competition to collaboration and sharing. I'll never forget an illustration by a guest lecturer in a class I was teaching one time. He had us get a partner and do a thumb war. If we were in person, I would have you actually do this together, but we'll have to just use our imagination. So imagine yourself doing a thumb war with your partner, and one of you wins. All right, great. So how many of you won? Half of you raise your hands, right? So now I have you do it again, and you try to see how many points you can score in 1 minute. So maybe you each get a couple of points. Then he tells you to see how many points you can get together. At this point, some people figure out that if they take turns winning, they can get dozens of points in 1 minute. When we work together, we can actually get to our goals better than when we try to compete with one another. So I'm going to pause here for you to consider this shift in worldview from ego to eco and from competition to collaboration. What does this bring up in you? How do you feel? What questions do you have? You can reflect on that for a moment and feel what you're feeling. Notice how your body and your spirit are reacting to this idea. So I imagine that although this may sound a little bit scary and like stepping out on a limb, that it's also something that we want to do, right? It's something that we want to be ready for. And we just kind of want to know how. So we're going to go into some of that now, although I obviously can't tell you exactly how to deal with your own situation, but we'll do some work to think through some of this together. So one way to think about this is an overarching framework for how we imagine our faith journey as we interact with the rest of the world. And then we'll think about how we orient our communal life in this direction. So a framework that I find helpful is called Watershed Discipleship. We'll go from Watershed Conquest here to Watershed Discipleship. This is a way of healing from watershed conquest of the empires of the past. Watershed discipleship is a way of learning from and with our watersheds, rather than the watershed conquest of those who colonized. It's a recovery from colonization, and it's something we can engage in together, whether our ancestors were the colonizers or the colonized, or some combination of both. Watershed discipleship is a term coined by biblical scholar and eco-theologian Ched Myers, and he describes it as a triple entendre. It has three main aspects. One, we're in a watershed moment of ecological crisis. Two, we can be disciples of Jesus in our watersheds. And three, we can be disciples of our watersheds. I don't know what each of you thinks about Jesus, but this is intended as a Christian framework. Ched Myers comes from a Mennonite tradition. So I think it's important that since Christian authority was used to support watershed conquest, we have a way of recovering Christianity from that perspective and incorporating aspects of Jesus's teachings that are lost when Christians collude with empires. The point being, the message of Christianity is inherently anti-imperialist, but it has been co-opted by the Roman Empire, European powers, and now the United States to stand for something that is the opposite of Jesus's message. Jesus' good news was for the poor, the oppressed, the prisoners, those with disabilities, all those seen as outsiders in the culture of his day. His message was of loving God and neighbors as ourselves, and it was good news for the poor, but difficult for those with wealth. He said that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. By which he doesn't necessarily mean heaven. He's talking about the beloved community, the community of solidarity and collaboration that he's building amongst his disciples. When a wealthy person asks him how to join this movement, he tells them to sell all they have and give it to the poor, and then come and follow him. Zacchaeus, who's the short guy that climbed a tree and to see Jesus passing by, maybe you remember from flannel graph or some other Sunday school, first day school lesson, but Zacchaeus had been skimming quite a bit off the top when he was collecting taxes. And he got so excited about the community that Jesus was forming that he made a pledge in Luke 19 that he would give away half his possessions. And he would pay people back 4 times as much as he had defrauded them. This is basically a reparations model, right? Anyway, so watershed discipleship invites us to be disciples of Jesus in our watershed where we are. If you want to translate it to be disciples of the way of the Spirit, the divine, or simply the way to be a decent human being, I'll let you make that translation in your head, but I'll use the language that works for me. I'll break down what watershed discipleship means a little bit and define the terms. So watershed is a cradle or container in which we live, the area of land in which all water flows to a common location. And at the top of a ridge, the water flows into one watershed. Let's see, there we go. At the top of a ridge, the water flows into one watershed or the other and eventually flows down into creeks, rivers, maybe lakes, and in most cases, eventually to the ocean. Ecologist Brock Dolman calls this a basin of relations because all the creatures in the watershed rely on one another as a community, sharing the same water source and the life that grows because of that water. So we're in a watershed moment of ecological crisis, and this framework of watershed discipleship helps us think about a manageable size of our ecological community. It's not our work to fix everything, so it can sometimes feel overwhelming to know where to begin. A watershed is also a nested concept. So in my case, I live in a small watershed with the folks that live around a small local creek, and that flows into the Willamette River, and the Willamette River flows into the Columbia, which starts up in British Columbia, Canada, and flows down through Washington and then between Washington and Oregon. And actually the Snake River is another major river that joins up with the Columbia, and it starts on the edge of Wyoming and flows through Idaho. So most of the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and part of the province of BC are part of the same large watershed, the Columbia Basin. And then of course, the Columbia flows into the Pacific Ocean, which connects us to all other watersheds. The idea of watershed discipleship is that our watersheds can be a natural unit of care that we can imagine and work within in partnership and learning from the other people and species in our watershed. Discipleship is the act of following and learning from a teacher. And watershed discipleship includes being a disciple of Jesus, or whatever name you use for the present teacher, and also being a disciple of our watersheds, of the other creatures, landforms, weather events, and so forth in the world around us. Watershed discipleship invites us to be from where we are and to be from where we are, to put down roots and to be connected to the place, the land, and the creatures. It helps us to have the humility of a learner. To learn from a teacher, we have to listen and then imitate what we see the teacher doing. We're not the conquering pinnacle of creation, bending the rest of the watershed and all its resources to our will and to our use, but we're learners, watching and listening regarding how best to tend and care for the place we live alongside and the others who live here. We're reflecting an eco perspective, learning to participate actively in the web of relations that make up this place we call home. We're learning to collaborate and work with everyone so that everyone has enough, so that the ecosystem continues to function and flourish. Although I have much to say about watershed discipleship, I will leave it at that for now, but you can read other things I've written about that if you'd like to send me an email later. But this framework helps us recover and begin the healing process together as unfortunate heirs of watershed conquest. So again, the three pieces of watershed discipleship are that we're in a watershed moment of ecological crisis, being disciples in our watersheds, and being disciples of our watersheds. You can think of this through a restatement of the golden rule that Wendell Berry put it. He says, "Do unto others downstream what you would have others upstream do unto you." I love that. We care for our space and pass the benefits down to those downstream, trusting those upstream to do the same for us. I want you to take a moment to reflect. Imagine yourself living in a way consistent with watershed discipleship. What does that world look like? Reflect on that for a moment of stillness. Watershed discipleship provides us a starting point for how we think about the worldview shift we're embarking on. It shows us the posture we can have as we interact with other people and other species, a posture of learning and curiosity, and it also opens up space for belonging. As we do this work of watershed discipleship, we begin to belong in the place where we are because we're learning about and engaging in the repair work that needs to be done. Like Zacchaeus, for those of us with wealth, this will include repairing our economic relationships so that we can move forward as part of the community rather than as conquerors hoarding the wealth for ourselves. And this is where it maybe starts to feel scary because we're embedded in a culture that is so individualistic that it's hard to imagine doing this and being okay. In this culture, we have to be afraid of each other. We have to compete or else we lose. Shifting to an eco perspective, living in the way of watershed discipleship means we have to trust each other and we have to have a community with whom to do this work. Therefore, I'm suggesting that we work on building hubs of climate resilience in our meetings and in our communities. Maybe your meeting is a hub, or maybe your meeting joins in a community already working on climate resilience in your region, but whatever the case, We participate with others in doing this work. I'll explain more about what this means, but first I'm going to give you a Quaker example. If you've studied early Quaker history, maybe you've heard of the Valiant 60, those who were called to be traveling ministers. They went off in pairs or trios to share about the experience they had of Christ teaching the people himself, inviting others to participate in the new community. I'm thinking about that group because I imagine that those Valiant 60 whose names we know and remember were also supported by a community of people who weren't out there in public, but who were doing equally important work. A friend in my meeting talks about the Valiant 60 and the boring 600. So the Valiant 60 went out there and had the adventures and shared the good news and the life of the spirit they'd found, but then there also had to be the boring 600, the people who stayed home, who helped take care of their kids, who kept their farm or shop running, who made it possible for that public witness to be able to happen. As we think about our meetings and our neighborhoods as hubs of climate resilience, I think of it like the Valiant 60. Maybe you're called to be part of today's Valiant 60 and be out there on the front lines taking radical action and speaking truth to power, or maybe you're called to be part of the boring 600. But either way, it's up to you to be involved and to do your part. The Valiant 60 could not have done their public work alone, and the deep and intense movement of the spirit that coalesced around their ministry would not have been able to happen if others had not played their supportive roles in creating a community for new people to join. In our own time in relation to climate justice, some people are good with the things that sound really boring but are of utter importance. I won't say that they are boring because they're probably interesting to some of you, and that's great. That's what we need. But we need people in support roles, people to hang out with the kids while the parents are doing activism, people to cook the food and weed the garden, people to crunch the numbers and figure out all the details for construction projects that reduce emissions, people who know how to design and implement landscaping changes so the meeting's land helps water cycle and build soil better, and so forth. So maybe you're not called to be part of the flashier parts of this movement for climate justice, but there's still much that you can be involved in and do. With that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different work of building hubs of climate resilience. I encourage you to reflect on these in your particular piece of the work right now, knowing that in different stages of our lives, we're called to different things. We talked about the different levels of environmental action earlier. So I'll bring that one back up. We've got the different levels of environmental action. And so the areas right inside the cultural worldview shift are public policy, advocacy, and activism. So activism is about pressuring for changes to the way we organize ourselves and the ways the laws are implemented. So advocacy and activism kind of go hand in hand there. So if we shift our own individual actions, it can make a small difference, but if we change the laws and policies governing our shared life, that makes a bigger impact. So working on political advocacy can be useful. You can write letters or emails, make phone calls to elected officials, meet with your legislators, or work on community organizing to get people to vote or to contact their legislators about bills that would be beneficial for environment and climate reasons. You can run for office yourself or support and work for other candidates with strong climate justice priorities. When doing climate and environmental advocacy, it's important to center voices of people of color, people who are low income, and communities being most directly affected by the impacts of climate change or pollution. Environmental justice recognizes the disproportionate impact of climate and environmental policy decisions and works to combat the problems of systemic racism that can unfortunately easily occur. If we're living in a predominantly white and relatively affluent community, it's easy to fall into a NIMBY situation. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And white communities rejecting polluting facilities in their neighborhoods, but then accepting that the polluting facilities have to go somewhere means that the polluting facilities are then sited in locations with less political, economic, and social power. In my experience with climate advocacy, we had a coalition of environmental organizations working toward a cap and invest bill that would hopefully reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. But several of the environmental justice organizations led by frontline communities withdrew from this coalition because they were not putting forward policies that would result in racial and economic equity. They formed a new coalition this last year led by environmental justice organizations, And the organization I'm a part of was able to participate in this coalition and help bring about a bill moving toward 100% clean energy in Oregon by 2040 in ways that do help center equity and justice. Finding organizations like this and following their lead is extremely important as we work toward a just and sustainable transition. Everyone can be involved in environmental and climate advocacy. You can simply choose the level that you have the availability and time for. But sometimes, even when people follow all the political and legal avenues available, injustice is happening in relation to environmental and climate concerns. Injustice to people and to other species, to our waterways and air, to the very planet on which we live. So then we work on activism to support and pressure the advocacy that we have already also been doing. So we also need to put pressure that on those causing pollution and other environmental harm now, while the harms are occurring, rather than waiting for laws to be passed to ensure those harms don't continue to happen. I know and appreciate the work of Equate that they're doing in and kind of adjacent to your yearly meeting. Equate stands for Earthquaker Action Team. They've targeted banks and that are funding fossil fuel projects, utility companies to get them to turn toward renewable energy, and they push for green jobs that pay a fair wage. That's a great organization to connect with for activism with friends in Philadelphia yearly meeting. And there are many other great organizations out there doing environmental activism on a range of concerns. One type of environmental activism I've been involved in lately is that I went to northern Minnesota for an action to stop the Line 3 pipeline. This action was called the Treaty People Gathering, and the Anishinaabe people invited everyone to come and draw attention to Line 3 to get President Biden to try to cancel it. It was called the Treaty People Gathering because they're emphasizing that we're all treaty people if we live here. We're all party to the treaties made between the United States government and indigenous tribes. If we're not indigenous, will we live up to these treaties with integrity? This pipeline would carry Canadian tar sands to market, crossing over 200 waterways, including going underneath the headwaters of the Mississippi River, and would facilitate the burning of greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to 50 coal-fired power plants. The Anishinaabe were guaranteed access to those lands for hunting, gathering, and practicing their spiritual ceremonies in their treaties. And the pipeline destroys the habitat and has already spilled several times while under construction. The state of Minnesota also gave Enbridge, the company building the pipeline, access to massive amounts of water for this construction project, all while northern Minnesota is in a major drought. Activists were invited to take actions that might result in arrest, although there were a range of non-arrestable roles too. Getting arrested does a few things. First, it draws attention. People see regular folks out there getting arrested and wonder why and learn more. Second, it can stop construction of the pipeline. Activists at the Treaty People Gathering, as well as throughout the months since, have been locking themselves to equipment so that they have to be removed before construction can continue. They've also been going to practice sacred ceremonies in the way of the construction, a right they are supposed to have according to the treaties. Third, the arrests offer space where aspects of the law can be tested. When people win rulings that they have a right to practice their sacred ceremonies there, this strengthens that tactic and the treaty rights of all Indigenous people in the United States. Maybe you're called to engage in environmental activism, or maybe you're not. If you are, it's important to follow the lead of those who are most impacted, such as Indigenous people or communities of color. If you aren't able to be on the front lines of environmental activism yourself, you can still support this work. So this is where the boring 600 comes in. You can give financially to those who are on the front lines and to their jail and legal fees. You can help those in your meeting who are called to this work by helping them with their household needs while they're engaging in activism or spending time in jail. You could offer to watch their kids or water their plants or take care of their pets. You could help financially support them so they don't have to also hold down another job while they're focused on stopping the destruction of our shared planet. You can amplify on social media, through newsletters or in other networks, about the work of environmental activists. You can speak up to political leaders about ending unjust and unsustainable practices, speaking up in support of activists. So as you're thinking about building hubs of climate resilience in your meetings and communities, activism and advocacy are two ways you can engage, either as leaders or as support people, building a network that makes it possible for people to engage more strongly in the advocacy and activism to which they're led. Then another way you can help build hubs of climate resilience is through your buildings and grounds, through creating networks of support, care, and right relationship in your communities. It's incredibly important that we have communities that can be more resilient, better able to support each other and adapt as the climate changes, better able to make sure that everyone has what they need to move forward justly and sustainably. Meeting houses can become hubs of climate resilience, or you can partner with other faith communities or neighborhood organizations that are already doing good work. Meetings often have land, buildings, and a network of skills and relationships that can help build a stronger community that is better able to withstand the challenges of the coming climate situation. What role might your meeting play in building up resilience of your community? Where is the Spirit leading you personally in your meeting together? Take a moment to think and listen about your role and the role your meeting might play in your local community. Hubs of climate resilience will relate to meeting the environmental or ecological, economic, and social needs of the community. None of us can do all the things, so we have to work together. And even though we can't and shouldn't try to do all the things, we can do something. Each community will have its own needs and vulnerabilities and its own assets. So you can find out what's going on in your community already. You can do a survey, have people engage in a needs assessment in your neighborhood. You can find out what other local groups are already doing, such as city governments, other faith communities, neighborhood groups, and so on. Pay particular attention to environmental concerns in your communities. What impacts of climate change or environmental pollution are already happening? How are these impacting communities of color or communities with less power in your region? Then you can map your assets in your own meeting and in your community. These can be skills or expertise of people or things that you might have to offer, such as education. Maybe you have land that can be used for growing a garden or by contributing to food justice. Or you could offer the space to an entrepreneur who wants to do urban gardening as a small business. Maybe you have a parking lot or other good space where a farmer's market could happen if one isn't already happening in your community. You can offer space for other groups to use your meeting house for educational events and skill shares. Maybe your meeting community would be willing to start a tool library, offering tools to the community like a library offers books. There are many ways your meeting can utilize the land and buildings that are under your care in order to partner with the community. In all of this, it's important to keep in mind the difference between charity and mutual aid. What does the community actually need and want? Who's best situated to offer that? What do you have that you can offer, and what do you need? Who will have control over the space and assets that your meeting has to offer? Some faith communities are experimenting with creative ways of ensuring that the church or other faith community doesn't have too much power and control more than it should. For example, some are creating a 501c3 nonprofit organization as kind of an umbrella group with a congregation as one aspect of that nonprofit, while others, such as community services, can also participate in that 501c3, utilizing the space of the congregational land and building. Some congregations I know of have done excellent work with community organizing. Some in North and Northeast Portland have conducted house meetings, needs assessments, and asset maps of their neighborhoods, and have served as hubs for their communities. They've heard concerns about affordable housing. At first, they thought, well, maybe we should give up our land to become affordable housing. Indeed, two congregations partnered so that one piece of land could become affordable housing, and now they're sharing one worship space. Other congregations heard from their communities that they felt it was important to have a worship and meeting space there to be used by the community, but they would appreciate help organizing the neighborhood to advocate together for affordable housing. That group formed a land and housing coalition, and they're working toward more equitable housing options for low-income people and communities of color in Portland. Another way faith communities can be involved in building hubs of climate resilience are in disaster preparedness. This works best, I think, if neighborhoods are already looking to you, your faith community space, as a safe place that's available for community use. So I don't think it should necessarily be done as a single goal. But that being said, offering a gathering space for people displaced by climate and other disasters can be really helpful. And this will happen more as we have stronger storms, heat waves, floods, fires, and other climate related emergencies. Friends would do well to prepare your meeting houses to host those displaced and those needing a safe space during a disaster. For example, your meeting might be able to get solar panels with a backup battery so you can have power during emergency, and people can charge their phones and other necessary equipment and store their medications that need refrigeration. Your meeting may create a plan for offering food and places to sleep for people in the case of a disaster. It may be good to partner with other faith communities in your city or neighborhood so that different congregations can work together to offer different things and come together to offer those services in a single location in the case of a disaster. You can work to build good awareness of these services before a disaster so that in the moment it's known that people can congregate in that designated space. That way you can also know how to find a place to go if you're the one displaced. As you do all this work, it's of utter importance to follow Black leaders in the community, or Indigenous, or other people of color, or those who are most impacted by economic inequality. If your meeting is predominantly white, you may not be the best position to find out what the community needs. Remember the concept of watershed discipleship and be willing to be disciples or learners of others in your community who are able to best identify community needs. It's also of incredible importance to do as much as you can to give up control of a lot of this. For those who are white, for those who have relative affluence, for those who are used to being the ones who know and have agency, it's easy to just assume you are the ones who know what needs to happen, who can best identify next steps, who get to adjudicate and allocate funds and control the process. Please resist this in yourself. This is part of the work that is spiritual, that's really important for people of faith to engage in specifically. Allow the Spirit to work in you to consider your assumptions about property ownership, your right to property and wealth that you have attained, your right to the building and grounds of the meeting that you steward, your right to the foundations and endowments you've inherited. I'm going to pause here again to give you time to reflect on all of this and allow the Spirit to bring to mind the places where you're being nudged into deeper action toward building and participating in a hub of climate resilience. Are you called to more intense advocacy or environmental activism? Are you called to material support those who are serving as the public face of this ministry? Are you called to work towards making your meeting house into a hub of climate resilience, or partnering with others in your community who are already creating such a hub in your congregation? How is the Spirit speaking to you about the recommendation to give up control if you're a person who usually benefits from the system as it is now? So take a moment to reflect on that. Finally, I move into the last portion of this talk, and then we'll spend some time in waiting worship together. This last portion has to do with the spiritual work that is before us and the practice of hope. I was wondering how to hold on to hope in the midst of all the grief and shame and fear of this time, so I did some research on hope. And hope is a word that we may throw around when we're really talking about something that we wish for, or something that's sort of a hope, but not really that important to us. But when we think about the true and deep type of hope we need to work on the nested issues of climate and racial justice and the other justice issues we face, it's important to think about a few things in relation to hope. So first of all, hope is a verb, so it requires action. It's something that we do. It's not something that we have. Hope requires us to be realistic. We have to be able to understand reality as it is, and there has to be a possibility that the thing we hope for can happen. We can't hope for something that's impossible. So like, I wish I had wings, but that's not possible. So it's not a hope, it's a wish. Those who have done some research on how people hope mention that it's important to visualize what we hope for and to be able to imagine a variety of pathways that can get us there. We can hope for a specific outcome, but alter it as we go, and we have to be able to be flexible enough in finding a new path when we experience failure or setbacks. Hope occurs when we start taking steps in the direction of what we hope for. It's also much easier to hope when we're engaged as a community, when we have a community to journey with, who can hold our hope when we aren't feeling hopeful. It's also really important to celebrate when we do take a step. Even if we don't feel like it was as successful as we might hope, we can celebrate that we tried, that we learned from it, and that we're going to try again. All of this is really important as we practice hope in relation to climate justice. Sometimes it feels so daunting, we feel paralyzed, but hope happens when we take a step. And then we take another step in the direction of our hoped for future. It happens when we act within and alongside a supportive community. It happens when we fail and keep trying, and when we celebrate. Along these lines, I have 3 final suggestions to offer. First, engage in your environmental and climate actions as spiritual practices with a community. Second, go where the Spirit is at work, even if it's not a place where you're currently comfortable. And third, incorporate rest as an environmental action that you do as a spiritual practice. So for the first one, engage climate and environmental actions as spiritual practices with a community. This might be your family or those you live with, or your meeting, or a small group at your meeting, or this might be a group of friends or coworkers or community members. But engage this work with others and think of it as a spiritual practice. What do you need to sustain your work and ground yourself spiritually? Do you need time in nature? Do you need time to be still and connect with the light before taking an action? One way that I ground myself is if I'm driving myself to an action, I will sing songs in the car that ground me and remind me of the spiritual aspects of the work that I'm doing. Then I try to remain connected to the Spirit at any action I participate in, hopefully emanating that spiritual grounding to the whole group that is gathered. You can think of actions such as eating vegetarian as a fast from meat, and think about the spiritual aspects of fasting. You can do things like recycling or composting as spiritual practices, letting each time you recycle or put food scraps in the bin as a chance to reconnect to the sacred and to the community of all life. Whatever works for you, make your environmental actions spiritual practices for yourself. This will help sustain you for the depth and breadth of this work. Second, go where the Spirit is at work, even if it's not particularly comfortable for you. In the last year, I was able to participate in the racial justice protests in Portland regularly, and I could feel the Spirit at work there intensely. As the movement progressed, mutual aid groups formed, giving out supplies and food so everyone could participate, and needs were met by the community. People showed up to make sure camps of people without homes were not removed, and to help an Afro-Indigenous family not be evicted from their homes. They also helped provide food and safe spaces when the wildfires hit last fall. These were expressions of the beloved community. It wasn't always comfortable there, but I learned so much about my own internalized white supremacy, about my community, and I built trust with others by showing up regularly. I also saw this at the Treaty People gathering, where the beloved community emerged in those few days we were together. Everyone helped each other and no one had a need. All were welcome and had food, shelter, and an important and meaningful place in the community. When one of the actions moved into an occupation of a space to block heavy equipment, people brought supplies, food, solar panels so people could charge their phones, composting toilets, everything that was needed so people were able to stay and occupy that space to do that sacred work. The beloved community emerged and the Spirit was powerfully present. Look for places like that and go there, or at very least support them in whatever ways you can. Also, a part of this is going where the Spirit is at work is to let the Spirit do the internal work that needs to happen in you. Maybe you feel triggered by shame or fear based on your assumptions from being surrounded by a culture of domination. Maybe you feel entitled to something and need to analyze that further. Maybe you're feeling the need to control or have power over someone or something else. Particularly if you're white, you need to do your work with the Spirit. A lot of this for white folks will be unlearning what we've subconsciously learned about our value and how we get it. Recognizing our value doesn't come from how much we have or how much we can produce, but each of us has intrinsic value and worth. We're all beloved children of God. We have to unlearn our assumptions about property ownership, recognizing the tenuous and not really justifiable reasons we can claim to own this land and any wealth we've accumulated from it. We have to unlearn our assumptions about being law-abiding, letting the Spirit query us about who got to make those laws and who they benefit. We have to let ourselves be broken open by the Spirit and made anew, following the Spirit rather than shutting down when we feel uncomfortable. We have to learn to deal with our feelings, apologize, do what it takes to repair the harm. This is all intensely spiritual work that we have to do internally, and also that we need a community to join with us on, because we can't do this stuff alone. And finally, don't forget to rest. This is hard work, and we have to be in it for the long haul. Our American culture tells us we're only worthwhile when we're doing something or producing something. So to counter that message, we need to rest. We need to value ourselves and others enough to take the space and time we need to sustain ourselves and our community. The Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. At this point, it's a privilege in the US to be able to rest, so we have to actually shift our systems to make it possible for everyone to have that opportunity. But as much as you're able, give yourself and others permission to rest and set up your own life as much as you can and your society to give people space and time to rest. The problems that we face are immense and scary and changing all the time and without notice. None of this is easy or comfortable work, and our resistance of the ways our culture currently works are difficult and painful. But this is also an exciting time that we get to live in. Are we up to the challenge? If you'll recall, I entitled this, Will Friends Act in Radical Faithfulness? This is our time to respond. This is our moment. We can't do it alone. What would John Woolman do can help us imagine what actions we could take, and what would 50 John Woolmans do, or 500, or 5,000? We can act together and create the space where it's possible for all of us to shift to a new worldview, to shift to a new lifestyle, to do the things that are required in order to stop the trajectory that we're on and move us toward a more just and sustainable future. And so I'll leave you with the queries that I shared earlier that, those are the 3 options, but here are the queries, I think. Nope, never mind. I'll just leave you with those 3 things and then read the query again and add my own query at the end. What do we as friends require of each other in this moment? What is required of our beloved community, and how do we share our light with the world as it pertains to racial and climate justice? And what is my next faithful step in helping build a hub of climate resilience in my community? So take these last few minutes to reflect on those queries and allow the Spirit to open you up and guide you to your next faithful step.